Forum for Democracy and Solidarity. Together with my speaker here, we'll dive into the Moldovan elections that will be this weekend and look towards the various things that are coming up. Before introducing my speaker here, the guest here in this webinar, I also want to say that we have a Q&A in this webinar. So feel free to ask all your questions and things you want to address here in this panel about Moldova. We will ask them here as well. So yeah, looking forward to this webinar, and thank you so much for joining us, Igor, from Moldova, from the Foundation for Democracy and Progress. You're the executive director here, so thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. It's our honor and pleasure to have a discussion with you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, likewise. And yeah, before we start off and delve into the elections, I'm curious to learn a bit more about your foundation. Can you tell a bit more about what you're doing at the Foundation for Democracy and Progress?
So as you rightly mentioned, Emil, the Foundation for Democracy and Progress is an organization that is, well, a political foundation, a think tank in the classic sense that bridges the gap between political parties, civil society, and other actors. We have a fairly long history. We've been established in 1996, and we were the precursor NGO to the formation of the movement for a prosperous, I think, and solidaric Moldova. And that was the movement that later became the Party for Democracy and Progress in 1997. So we've been for many, many years existing. Since 1996 until 2017, the foundation used to be called the Foundation for the Support of Parliamentarism and Democracy. That mandate was obsolete at some point because we thought we had a bit of democracy and a bit of parliamentarism, and it was time for a bit more progress. So that's how we've revamped ourselves. We have a fairly good cooperation with different progressive and social democratic, I should say, organizations all over Europe. We have a very long and lasting collaboration with the Olof Palme Center from Sweden, but also for the Foundation Max von der Stoel. We had a collaboration with the Westminster Foundation, but also a few more. I mean, FES, just to name a few. Of course, we're honored to have this lasting, discussion and cooperation with you as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for joining us. And yeah, you're in an excellent position to tell us everything about what's coming up this Sunday. And yeah, just to start about that, like, what is at stake this Sunday? Where are we looking to in these elections?
It is. Well, the presidential elections are coming ahead. It's not something new. Moldova is, mind you, a parliamentary republic. So in essence, it shouldn't be that important. The president under the mandate has fairly limited powers. It is the head of the state that should serve as the diplomatic head of the state, that should serve honors and maybe have some presidential orders. But in principle, the parliament and the government is what matters the most. However, these elections are very important for a few other reasons. And I think first on the list is the fact that the elections coincide with the EU referendum. So citizens are not going to just vote for the candidate that they think should become the next president of Moldova. They're also going to vote whether or not they are in favor or against the amendments of the constitution, whereby we would include a new paragraph that would say that we believe that the primordial vector for development of Moldova should be the European integration. So that's one of the reasons. Second, of course, and the more obvious one, the elephant in the room, is that there is a war going on in Ukraine, and there's a lot of Russian involvement and interest, not just in Moldova, but in many of the Central Eastern European countries. We've seen the results of elections in Austria and Germany in the recent period. That is concerning. And of course, we know that in Moldova, there's tremendous pressure and dirty money flowing in here to rig the votes, to try to shape the votes so that the next president becomes someone that is more inclined to have a pro-Russian or maybe a more neutral or not such a strong pro-European voice. So that's where that big fuss is coming from.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a really important election in that sense, that you see, like, it's also being presented like a choice between the European course and maybe a more pro-Russian course, right? Is that also the feeling you have in Moldova at the moment, like at this vote, or?
It is. I mean, you're right. You're correct in saying that that's the feeling, but it's also the wrong feeling. It is a feeling that was induced both by the foreign forces that in some way have an involvement in this. And I say so because, I mean, for the Russian case, it's clear, right? It's clear why they would want to have a president that is more pro-Russian. it is a bit more complicated when it comes to the stance of the incumbent president. So Mrs. Sandu, she is the incumbent president. She's had 4 years of mandate. But because her mandate is quite unprecedented, she has the majority in parliament. She has her own government. So she had full control of the country for the past 4 years. So for her, the position of president was the crown of the jewel, basically, because she was the leader of this party, but the party also controlled everything in the country. So 4 years now have passed. She wants to get a for pass is slipping, and I think her personal support is also much lower than it was the previous time around. So the complication comes from European partners, leaders. We had Ursula von der Leyen, I think, just last week here. They come in with a strong pro-European stance, but the way the media reflects this also shapes the debate as though Sandu is the sole pro-European candidate or promise in this country, which I think is a bit of a shift in how the discussion should take place. I mean, we all should mind the democratic elections and the principles that all or many other candidates are also pro-European, and they should have the right to say. But either way, I think you're right in mentioning that the election is pretty much a clivage, a shift between whether you're pro-East or pro-West. But that's also a clivage that many candidates favor, namely, I think the top two best polling candidates. So Mrs. Sandu and Mr. Stoyanoglu are both very happy about this. That's how exactly they wanted the debate to be shaped, because then it becomes a question of, is it her or is it him?
Yeah. Yeah, that's indeed for the biggest forces. It's nice to have this standoff, and they can attract a lot of voters in that way as well. And maybe that's also a good question to follow up to, because who are the main players at this presidential election? Because we know also that you need to pass a threshold of 50% in the first round, which is this Sunday. And if it's not the case, then we will have a standoff, right? Also by the two biggest candidates.
Yeah.
So who are like the main candidates at this presidential election to look out for?
I mean, I've already mentioned several names, and I think I should give a bit more background to this. I will start with the list of candidates, and then I can explain a bit the occurrence of the referendum and how that's a bit controversial, and then how odds are going to happen, or what's the most likely scenario. So first is probably, well, I should start by mentioning there's 11 candidates on the list. The candidates are pretty well known. I think I should start with the incumbent president. So the current president, Mrs. Sandu, she's running for re-election. She is the candidate of the Pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity, and she advocates, of course, for the continued EU integration path. She has a very strong pro-Western stance, and her administration has made efforts to curb corruption, I think, and strengthen Moldova's democratic institutions. Although the achievements of the party are questionable. We'll test that next year when the parliamentary elections take place. Her personal polling is good. The numbers suggest she's probably polling around 35% of support, depending on which poll you analyze. But she faces strong opposition. And her party has been mired in scandal in parliament. Not herself, but of course the party has been. I think she's also regarded as consolidating her political force by obstructing a bit more now the freedom of speech, but also using this fear mongering of the Russian influence. Of course, that's a legitimate influence, but I think at many times this is used as an excuse to possibly limit the free campaigning or the free democratic process for other candidates, or at least that's something that is being discussed out there, and we can then go into more detail with this when the questions and answer sessions begin. She's also questioned by the fact that she is accused of abusing a bit the administrative resources that she has. Mind you, she has the parliament and the government, so all the ministers, all the members of parliament in her majority party. She refused to participate in public debates. She refused 3 so far, and she has used international support to shape the debate domestically. So she is painting herself as this, sole pro-Western or pro-European candidate is actively supported by leaders of the EU, but also leaders of states of European Union, but also ambassadors here. And then I should start with the opposition. So her main opposition candidate probably is Mr. Alexander Stoyanoglu. He's the candidate of the Party of Socialists. This represents a pro-Russian faction. He personally was not well, at least as far as I'm concerned, he was not a member of the Party of Socialists before, but he used to be a member of parliament with PDM years back. Then he quit. He became a prosecutor, and he was also the prosecutor general at the start of the mandate of Mrs. Sandu. And he was kicked out of office by the PAS party in parliament under some controversial, I should say, situations. We can discuss that, into more detail again if there's interest in that. So perhaps he is an attempt of Russia to craft a soft power approach in Moldova, because his campaign centers on enhancing, of course, Moldovan ties with all members. He says he's in favor of EU integration, but he wants a more moderate position on it. He also enjoys significant support from, I would say, double negative voters, those who would rather vote him, not because they expressly support the socialists or him personally, but rather because they want this to be a vote of protest towards Maia Sandu, and especially towards PAS, that could maybe send a message in Moldovan politics, things should change. And he's also largely viewed as being the most likely contender for her in the second round. I think by now it is pretty clear that Mrs. Sandu has little chance of getting more than 50% of votes from the first round.
What is the polling of Mr. Stoyanoglu at the moment?
I would struggle to give a number that I could sign under, because of course under PAS's polling, his polling is very shallow. But in online voting that is organized by different media platforms that are more independent, I should say, he has amassed, close to 20% or more. So, I mean, of course, then there's the question of how many of the undecided voters, or those who wouldn't tell, are missing from those numbers. So it's hard for me to give a number that's accurate. But I think the election on Sunday will prove whether or not these two are the main contenders. And then if I should go on with other opposition candidates, the remaining 9, I can start in not a specific order, just out of memory. First would be Renato Usati. He represents our party, that's how it's called. It's a very populist and eccentric figure who campaigns on social welfare promises and electronic pharmacies that are subsidized, or local social stores. So he's a classic populist. He equally advocates for a bigger role of the state. He promised to, erect and strengthen the role of the security institutions in Moldova, and he wants a greater grip of the government to tackle corruption and lawlessness. Of course, many of those are made in a very flamboyant way, and one should question whether or not he's capable of doing that in the position of president, but also what is the limit of that and how concerning that is. He might try to show a pragmatic stance, but he lacks international backing enjoyed by Sandu. And most importantly, he is viewed by many as a potential spoiler, an undercover candidate for PAS. Again, this is all pure speculation, so I don't have any evidence. I can't sign under it, but I'm just voicing what's out there in the political sphere here. And he has a very controversial past. He's been accused by his former political proteges that he's a splinter candidate, somebody with a criminal past, and with significant wealth of dubious origin. He initially earned all of that money in Russia. He's now prosecuted in Russia, and he's in Moldova. He's involved, at least mired in the scandal of orchestrating several killings of notorious bankers, and his dirty past is believed to be held against him by the Security and Information Service, perhaps, that is an institution controlled by the president. And maybe he is trying to steal or splinter votes from this pro-left or far-left electorate who would otherwise never vote for Sandu. I mean, it's curious to see whether or not he will have a stance in the second round and whether he can shift sides. Next on would be Irina Vlah. She's the former governor of Gagauzia. She runs as an independent candidate. Gagauzia is this autonomous region in the south of Moldova that is of Turkish origin. They have their own language, so they act as an autonomy. She is a former member of parliament. She has a technocratic approach, I should say. Her campaign emphasizes economic reforms and stability, making her maybe attractive to conservative voters there. Well, she also wants to position herself as a centrist figure, and she, more than many other candidates, focuses on the regional autonomy and the economic development of that region. Of course, there are looming questions whether or not she's also perhaps an undercover agent or an actor running on behalf of Russia or other actors, who knows. Next on that list would be Ion Kiku. He is from the Party of Consolidation and Development. He's a former prime minister. He has a very good bureaucratic, technocratic approach. It's a very good team, I would say, of technocrats who used to be members of different ministries in the past. He positions himself as a central to central right or left, depending on the interpretation, political party. But he's also probably one of the most vicious critics of Sandu and PAS. I think he takes it to the next level because he goes personal sometimes in the debates or in his statements on social media. And
so even more personal or even more heavy than, for example, the main opposition candidate at the moment, Stoyanoglu, you would say.
Surprisingly, I think surprisingly, Stoyanoglu has run I think the debate he has run was not personal, and the criticism he voiced were, well, biased, but they were not vicious, I would say, not toxic. And I think Mr. Kiku takes it one step further, at least in my view. And I think that arrogance and that personal issue he has with Sandu makes him not immediately popular. He failed to gain significant traction, and although he declares himself as being a pro-European actor, his conservative position is probably making him a candidate who could be suspected of playing for both sides at worst, or at least somebody who is not good in articulating his position at best, I would say. Next on the list, I would name Andrei Nastase. He is the former deputy prime minister. He's running as an independent, and he is expected to garner the votes from the Moldova's urban or pro-democratic base, pro-Western base, I should say. He is the former coalition partner of PAS, and together with Mrs. Sandu 4 years ago, they were protesting together against the then regime of Plahotniuc and the PDM, the Party of Democratic Party of Moldova. Sorry, and I think his position is also personal when it comes to Sandu. He has made some very strong statements during the campaign, and I think his intention is to steal some of the electoral base from Sandu. I think he has limited international support, but at least he is certainly, not somebody you could immediately accuse as playing undercover for other forces. I think he's definitely pro-European. He believes in those statements, at least. And then I could mention a few more candidates. They are, even less significant than the one I mentioned. One of them would be Vasile Tarlev, a former prime minister of the Communist Party rule years back. I think it's clear he is acting as a pro-Russian proxy that probably appeals to these communist, romantics, elderly voters who need to be mobilized this way. And maybe in the second round, they would cast a vote for a more uniting, I should say, opposition candidate. Another candidate would be Natalia Morar. She's an independent again. She was previously an active and acclaimed journalist, pro-European, pro-PAS. She was very active in the protest movement together with Sandu. And they fought together against Plahotniuc, the oligarch that is now a runaway controversial figure in Moldova. But she became controversial, or she is controversial, because she later married another oligarch, Vyacheslav Platon, who used to fight with Plahotniuc, and he's now hiding in London under this political refugee status. And she's probably the anti-hero for PAS and Sandu. She's this disillusioned voice of criticism against PAS, and she is, a significant challenger, at least in terms of the late motives she puts out there, because she's probably very discomforting for Sandu as a former ally. She has uncovered quite a bit of the corruption and lawlessness accusations against PAS's party and government.
Okay.
Of course, we have to question how genuine she is in her position. And of course, she also declares herself pro-European, but that's also something we have to discuss into more details. Other openly pro-Russian candidates are running from this victory bloc, and this is the most flamboyant of the spectra. This is a bloc that was formed in Moscow, and it was run by this runaway oligarch Ilan Shor, who is hiding in Moscow now, and who is probably the main force of the Kremlin, at least the dirty force of the Kremlin that is being used to rig votes to buy votes in Moldova. Insofar, the security services in this country have seized more than 130 million Moldovan lei in various currencies, revealing the scale of this Russian influence. I mean, in spite of all this, there's numerous court decisions that blocked him from running, and he's not on the list. The Electoral Commission blocked him as not a genuine candidate. He still campaigns undercover. He still promises voters money or monetary gains for casting the votes in support of a pro-Russian candidate. There are two more candidates I should mention with very limited support. I should say one is Victoria Fortuna, a former prosecutor now turned politician who criticizes Sandu, and specifically her failure to reform the judicial sector, which is one of her main promises, and probably is an undercover spoiler that is supported by either Platon or Russia, depending on what rumor we should trust. And last but not least is another candidate. His name is Tudor Olianovsky. He's the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, runs as an independent candidate. He's the former, well, he's also openly pro-European, but probably could be accused at least, or suspected at least, of ties with former oligarch Plahotniuc, because he used to be very close to that person. He openly denies this accusation, but of course we can't know.
Yeah.
So I think that's enough on the candidates.
Yeah, that's quite a good overview, I think, that we just had from you, Igor. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit long to swallow. I hope
Yeah,
that
but it gives a nice idea of who is all running here, and what persons we are talking about. It's a good, and also I think a good start, and already a lot of things to delve deeper into. But of course, being conscious of time, we have to make some choices. And one of the choices I wanted to make, and the question I wanted to ask is specifically about the PAS party and the main themes of this election, because. In some of the analysis on the Moldovan elections, there is also, especially also looking further towards the future, towards the parliamentary elections, you also alluded to it, is that the PAS party has lost some popularity because also of their economic policies and, their failure to, for example, also create economic prosperity for lower wage incomes, for example. Do you feel that this is at the moment like the biggest threat to the PAS party in Moldova in these elections, or maybe also upcoming times after these elections as well?
I mean, we are a way off now. The mandate of the parliament will expire next summer in July, I think. So the election should probably happen sometime next year, in summer of next year. It's evident now that PAS has lost its support. I mean, depending on it's hard to find good independent polling. I'm guiding my judgment based on the IREI, the International Republican Institute polling that is provided to all political parties, and it is quite detailed in the analysis. It's provided quarterly, and in it we can clearly see that there's a long list of questions and concerns that the PAS electorate has. And there's a very good share of disillusioned voters from PAS, both domestic but also in the diaspora internationally, that feel that PAS has not delivered on this large promise of economic reform, judicial sector reform, and especially anti-corruption position. And I think to this end, it probably is a valuable concern. I think PAS voters have all the right to ask that, because she has won an overwhelming majority of the votes during the last election in parliament. I think it's only the second time in the modern history of Moldova since 1992 that a party has more than 50 mandates in parliament. So and has all three positions: the presidency, the parliament, and government. So they had full leverage. They had 4 years to do whatever they wanted to. They have had 4 years and all the right to implement whatever agenda or ambitious manifesto they had. And instead, I think the electorate hears different kind of excuses. Well, the war is here, maybe COVID was there, and other issues take place. Moldova is an underdeveloped country. It takes time. It's all valid, but I think this disillusionment was only natural, given how much was promised and how little was delivered in the eye of the voter. So I think it's fair to consider, or to at least be concerned, that in the next parliamentary elections, I highly doubt PAS can get the same result. I think they will poll anywhere around 20 to 30%. They will continue to be the strong pro-European voice. unless there's not going to be splintering or quarreling inside the party. There's many rumors about different camps inside PAS and the factions that they have there and the issues they run. I mean, I don't want to get into speculation, but I think it's also reasonable to consider that PAS will need a coalition partner in the next parliament in order to continue the pro-European agenda. And there's no issue with the pro-European integration as such. There's only an issue with how this integration was monopolized by one player or some players, I should say.
Yeah, and also in what ways it forms also regarding the social economic integration, also development of the economy, which can go, of course, all kinds of directions. And if I understand correctly, Igor, what you were saying is that this leaves also room for progressive, more social oriented parties that have also a pro-European stance. Maybe they're not represented that much on the ballot this time during the presidential elections, but yeah, what kind of are there any parties and interesting political forces that are also coming up in that sense in Moldova, you feel?
There are several parties now. I mean, I should start by saying that in principle, the Social Democrats are probably one of the second longest, running political force in this country. I think Communist Party is the oldest, and former PDM exists since 1997. It's a fairly old party by Moldovan standards. Unfortunately, Moldovan parties here have a very short-lived. They usually are born and die with their leaders, and that is probably anywhere from 4 to 8 years, the average lifespan of a party, as is the story with PAS now and many more. Hopefully, they have a long history ahead. But I think many of the problems our country has is in the lack of institutionalized politics, political parties that are lasting institutes that can transition power, can change and adapt. And former PDM used to be a very strong Social Democratic Party. It has its own share of controversy because it has been run by Plahotniuc, this oligarch who's now on the run. And it had to take a lot of blame for that personally. And unfortunately, the people of PDM, they went to several different parties now. They went to, I think the largest party that benefited from it, and one with the highest hopes now, is the party of Mr. Ion Ceban, who is the mayor of Chisinau. He has personally received, I think, more than 100,000 votes, 130,000 direct votes in the Chisinau local election recently. So that makes him a very promising candidate. I mean, on its own, if he can translate those votes in the parliamentary elections, he would have 12 mandates in the next parliament.
He wasn't interested to go into presidential elections, or
he was not, yes.
Okay.
And I think that was a very smart move because he would have to quit his position as mayor of Chisinau, and he would have to risk it all. And he would also have to enter this cleavage of whether he's pro-European or pro-Russian. PAS attack him viciously. They want to paint him as a pro-Russian because he was, of course, a member of the Socialist Party in the past. But I think he's quite progressive, and I think he's shifted to central left. I think he has, for the past 2 years, demonstrated he is quite pro-European in his positions. Of course, we can argue a lot about, is it genuine, is it not? But at least his mandate was won with his promise that he is a pro-European, mayor that tries to turn Chisinau into this European capital. And I think the electorate in Chisinau is happy with him, and he has good momentum. He's probably one of the most promising locomotives, if I should put him that way, for a future force on the central left, a future progressive force. There are a few more. Former PDM now has reformed, turned into PSDM. They have a lot of experience, but they lack a leader. So they're complementary with Ceban. Ion Kiku and his party has also a lot of the ministers that PDM used to have. Whether or not he would consider this, we don't know. But just by the way I mentioned it, it's 3 parties that could maybe create a bloc or a coalition or even fuse together and become a force that could, potentially be a viable coalition partner for PAS in the next parliament of social democratic origin, but also pro-European. And this would, render this overarching democratic consensus, wider democratic consensus.
Yeah, that's very interesting, but also, still hypothetical. But it could be an interesting subject to delve into deeper. Maybe another webinar when we go towards parliamentary elections.
We at the Foundation for Democracy and Progress have been working with this for the past, almost 2 years now. We've been organizing these political dialogue platforms, discussions, where we are working together, trying to encourage that sort of dynamics in those parties. Of course, the decision is all theirs. We'll have to wait and see if it turns out into something good for the country. But at least we're trying, and we think that's important because we need a strong central left, because that balances the power between the extremes, the right and the far left, or the extreme left, I should say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to move ahead, we have a question from the Q&A also, and
Yeah.
it's also on one of the topics I also wanted to delve a bit deeper into, and it's from Casey King, and the question is the war in Ukraine an important topic in the current campaign, and how is it spoken about?
Good question. I think it is. I think Moldovans experience what maybe more European countries are experiencing now. They acknowledge, they understand the risks of this running war, but they're also running tired. The electorate is running tired of that leitmotif. And I'm not saying this in a bad way anyway. I mean, the concern, if anything, for Moldova is the most real one that can be there. Just this morning, I think I read this news article, with a statement issued by the Institute for International Study of War that, again warns that if Ukraine is to fail, Moldova will become the cherry on the cake. It's going to be just a question of weeks before it fails because it lacks an army, it lacks support the very small countries. It's easy for Russia to take control of it, and it'll be an easy win. So, of course, it's a very important leitmotif. Fortunately, the campaign, I would say, at least from my observations, has not been dominated by ways in which they paint it. I think most politicians, even the active pro-Russian politicians, don't take a stance on it because they know it's very dividing, sorry, on the one hand. On the other hand, they also realize that even the pro-Russian voters, they are probably not very happy with well, not very happy is a compliment. They're probably, at least I should consider they should be very concerned with the way in which this war has turned out, what the motives of it are. And because Russian propaganda here has been stopped, I think 3 or 4 years back, the Russian TV channels no longer air. The brainwash is not as dramatic as it maybe used to be, some years back. So I think the electorate can easily discern that things are not right and that the war in Ukraine is part of it, but it's not certainly a major leitmotif or something that influences in a big way the election, I should say.
Yeah, and because there are a lot of reports coming out of a lot of concerns about Russian disinformation, Russian mingling into this election. In what way do you see that then?
I think we see it in the social media platforms, much like the rest of Western Europe, and that's concerning because it's easy to turn off. I mean, you take the licenses of those TV channels or radio channels that are openly, promoting Russian propaganda, and that was easily done. The problem now moves on to the next level that's more diffuse. I mean, how do you tackle this, social media stream of information coming in our lives, whether it's Telegram or YouTube or other platforms in which there's a lot of Russian propaganda, and it's also sophisticated Russian propaganda now. They changed their approach. They no longer, I mean, maybe in Russia they paint the classical, globalist kind of dirty propaganda, but I think in the West they try this more soft power propaganda where they put out fake news or they try to, shapeshift different topics and try to interpret them in a different way. And I think that's where this big concern is. And of course, in Moldova, it's very, very easy. As you rightly mentioned, economic issues always have been this classic leitmotif of concern. If you analyze the IRI polls years back, during the past decade, the key issues, top 5 issues, are always, I mean, with the exception of the pandemic, when health became very high on that list, there usually are economic problems. We call them kitchen problems, right? It's whether it's, the employment, the rate of inflation, what are the pension standards, how are we going to attract new investment, how are we going to stop migration? I mean, these are the classic leitmotifs. And for Russians, it's easy to meddle with it because, as I rightly mentioned, they have seized hundreds of millions of lei in hard cash that was already in the country. I mean, you can imagine how much was not stopped or identified by security services and ended up in the pockets of voters that are poor, uninformed, and not in a position to make a choice.
Yeah, and this information you see on social media, does it target, for example, Maya Sandu and the PAS party a lot directly, or is it also focused a lot on international, for example, Euro-Atlantic integration, or is it a combination? And how do you see also the candidates aligning with this, and especially the candidates that are considered pro-Russian in that regard?
I think most of it, as I rightly mentioned, at least one on social media, comes with this subtle accusations. Some of them are based maybe in half truths or in full truths, and of course, I think a lot of it has been through Telegram, TikTok. I think more now. I'm not an active user of it. I don't have an account, never had one, but at least I'm gathering this because it's in this kind of a childish, in this play format, I should say, people get these music videos that are half joke or maybe half accusation against Sandu. But of course, one has to question who has an active interest in promoting those. And it's easy to see how the bot farms that we know exist in Russia can produce millions and millions of such, posts all over social media that can shape the electorate. And then, of course, it's easy for the candidates to dismiss it, because I think if we were to ask Mr. Stoyanoglu or any other candidate that would be, maybe accused of being pro-Russian, he would say, I never sponsored this. I never signed under this. This is just for fun. Somebody's doing it and it's good for them. People have concerns. So it's easy to dismiss it as being, not significant. Well, that is a way of doing campaigning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's also just putting out a lot of conflicting information and making people in that sense also confused. And that also creates a web in which more disinformation is also more easy to grasp certain people. So I think that this is like the tactic we see across Europe and across the world in many elections. Yeah.
And I also saw some fake news that are concerning. These are probably the more specific and targeted, techniques used by Russian politocrats, or whatever they are called, propagandists. I saw recently this message of Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, being, speculatively inflated in the Moldovan news and saying, hey, all the migrants are now going to be kicked out of Europe and they will be put in camps in Moldova or in the Balkans. So that's, something you should think of. So they're using, breaking things from the context, trying to, make a bubble out of it, and try to, plant panic and confusion in the electorate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a well-known tactic in these disinformation campaigns. And that's also another question I had, also maybe tied to this mingling in the election in these ways. But are there specific concerns about the election integrity? Because there are also now colleagues from us, people from across. There are a lot of international observers coming to the elections, also observing the elections. And are there specific things that are also there are worries about in this regard?
I think there's a lot of attention, thankfully, to this election. I think the European partners have been very, very attentive to the concerns that the Moldovan authorities and Moldovan government has had. I think they were offered a lot of support in that sense. And that's very good news. We also saw a lot of them visiting us in the last year alone. I think all 27 heads of European states were in Moldova. Bulboaca, we had the summit, and I think over the course of last year we had a lot of heads of state visit us. And like I mentioned, the head of the European Commission was here just 1 week ago, and that's also a good sign, because it shows Moldova has a future. It offers a clear path for reform, and it doesn't promise it doesn't promise something that is not earned. It says that's the path to it. Here's the plan, work the plan, and then you get the benefit. And I think this resonates very good with the electorate. I think the overwhelming majority of Moldovans are in favor of European integration, because they now realize this is the sole viable path for our country to remain civilized, democratic, free, and prosperous. But I also think it's important to be careful in how we shape and use that support. I think PAS has been exploiting those visits and that support for Moldova in order to translate it in the support for PAS. And I think that's important, because European partners are not in favor of one candidate or the other. Of course, PAS is supported by the EPP. They have their own large family in the European Parliament. But it's important for European dignitaries to also observe who they offer support to. And maybe there's more pro-European voices out there, because it has to be democratic, number one. Number two, I think I have this personal issue with this, that PAS has, Mrs. Sandu maybe, or PAS has chose to make the referendum on the same day of the presidential election. I think this goes against the international practices on it. It goes against the Venice Commission's advice on this. And in fact, this goes against the electoral code provisions that expressly stated in Moldova, elections cannot, national referendums cannot take place on any elections of national scale, whether it's in the parliament, local level, or presidential level. And there's two decisions of the Constitutional Court in Moldova that interpreted it and confirmed it. Yes, it's not good, because then it's ship-shaped, it takes the topic of the referendum and it mixes it with politics, which is not good. And PAS, I think, knew very well that this shouldn't be the good practice, and yet they chose to go ahead with it. They changed the electoral code just a few months before the election, And they went ahead in spite of criticism, in spite of it going against the democratic principles internationally and the Venice Commission's advice. And they made it on the same day. And I know why, because they mobilized voters this way. But the big risk is that voters could show up there and not express a voice on whether they are in favor or against this change to the constitution, which in fact gives nothing, by the way. It doesn't give any guarantee that we will become part of Europe. It's not a law that is, important. It's a populistic way of saying, hey, the constitution says that. Well, good for you, but it doesn't promise anything. But I mean, it's good. They mobilize voters. But what if the voter is pro-European, but he comes there and he says, I'm going to put a no on this, just to, give a kick in the butt to Mrs. Sand and pass. And I think that's risking a bit too much because we're talking about strategic interests of our country, geopolitical interests for the decades to come. And I think a party is using this small window of opportunity to try to get more votes, to put it simply.
Yeah, and that's also a way which also can be damaging potentially to the whole process, but it also maybe is also a political risk for the PAS party completely tying their party and their campaign to the EU integration process, and that's like becomes the main political idea. So and regarding this referendum, what is the expectation here? Also, when are there any polls on?
I have not seen any polls. At least the wide expectation is that it should be positive, that people, the overwhelming voice is pro-European. And I also personally expect that. Just to clarify, I am, overwhelmingly in favor of being pro-European. And that's a leitmotif we sign under, and the political parties we work with, that's the main principle we observe, that they are pro-European. But I also think that it's not the right time. It should have been done in a more, balanced and timely fashion. There's enough time ahead to do it at a more on a better occasion, just not during the election day. It's happening now, so we'll see how that turns out. And of course, as you say, it's a big gambit, it's a big risk. PAS and Sandu took it. We'll see if it turns out according to our expectations.
Yeah, exactly. And just to come back to my earlier question about election integrity itself and maybe allegations of voter fraud or something, are there specific concerns there at the moment for these elections?
I mean, like I said, the victory bloc has been kicked out of the election. They're not on the list of candidates, and they had, I think, several parties there, several candidates. I lost the count because the moment a party is banned, Mr. Shore, re-registers another one or buys another one that exists out there that is small and inexistent until the money flows into it. So of course that is a clear indication of vote breaking. If anything, the amount of money seized in Moldova in cash suggests voter breaking is going to take place. There is wider concern in terms of whether or not there's going to be organized transportation of voters from Transnistria, for example, into voting sections on the right bank of Nistru, and maybe trying to change the outcome of the referendum, especially. Maybe that's a big risk. And also, I think there's been rumors out there that many candidates have been, at least I think the head of the police here, the commissar, we call him, Mr. Cernauțeanu, he came out 2 weeks ago and he said there is a lot of evidence that the police has collected on different candidates that are doing electoral fraud, and that has been sent to the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission has been silent since, but there is rumors there that several candidates could be pulled out of the race. I mean, I don't want to speak in terms of speculations and gossips. We'll see if that materializes. But it would also be a bad sign because it happens, if it will happen now, it will happen 2 or 3 days before the election itself, which is not a good sign. I mean, if anything was fishy, it should have been spotted weeks ahead.
Yeah, exactly. I will move towards another question from the chat from Peace, and that's, is there voting from abroad? And if so, do you expect Moldovan diaspora influence the elections in some significant way?
There certainly is, and that's another issue that has caused controversy in Moldova. Voting from abroad takes place, and in the past, the vote of the diaspora, which is always pro-European, pro-Western overwhelmingly. Of course, there's the pro-Russian diaspora living in Russia, but that is less in significance, or at least in share compared to the one that lives in Europe and in America, for instance. There's over 1 million Moldovans living in Europe alone, and I think if you add them all up, it's probably 1.5 or more. So it's significant diaspora given Moldova's population in total is about 3 million. And I think during the last round of elections, Mrs. Sandu enjoyed a lot of the support of that diaspora. She specifically campaigned in the diaspora because she knew that's a stronghold where she will win votes. And this time around, it's very hard to gauge it because, well, number one, there's not a lot of polling, if any, polling done in where the diaspora lives. Number two, you can only base it on opinions that you find on social media or speculation out in the press. And I think now there's a lot of talk about disillusionment with Mrs. Pass, specifically in the diaspora. I think this is one of her hardest critics, one of the most disillusioned electoral basins. We'll see if that is true or not. Number two, I think that is controversial in this is that they've introduced voting by correspondence, and the mechanism of that voting by correspondence has been, again, quite confusing. It happened just months before the election itself, and many viewed that as an opportunity to exploit this in order to maybe do electoral fraud in favor of the party in government or the president. I don't want to get into that because I don't want to speak in terms of gossips and speculations. I hope that those concerns are valid and that the international observers and our international partners will look into it so that democracy prevails.
Yeah, exactly. So that's also definitely a thing also to look into closely during these election observation campaigns which are going on, and interesting to hear also about the role of the diaspora also that regarding the popularity of Mrs. Sandu. So looking towards the elections on Sunday, we will have the referendum, we will have the presidential vote, and we will probably go to a runoff, and that will be on November 3, right?
Yep, 2 weeks afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the two candidates that are the biggest. So yeah, we'll
best
definitely
polling candidates. Yeah,
the best polling candidates, and we'll definitely look towards those elections as well, and probably be in touch over that too. But definitely also for the parliamentary elections, I think this is also maybe even more interesting because all these smaller parts, of course, have more role there as well, right? If you go to parliamentary elections with these smaller parties, it's also more easier for them to come into parliament and to influence the Moldovan politics. At the moment, no questions anymore from the Q&A. So I'm also checking my own notes, but the main things I wanted to ask you about these elections, I think we've gone through. So I've got a lot of information over the last 50 minutes. So thanks a lot, Igor, for this and for this small insight to the Moldovan political sphere, but also very interesting and very important also, I think, for the broader European integration process and the democratization process in Moldova, but also for the broader region and European Union itself. So thanks a lot for all this information.
Thank you, Emil. The pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And maybe the one thing I still wanted to ask you, and that's what I forgot to ask at the beginning of the webinar, is about the turnout, because I always want to ask this and we didn't came to it. What are your expectations there before rounding off our webinar? Because that's also interesting to know, like how many people are showing up you expect.
Traditionally, the presidential elections are the most popular elections in Moldova. Maybe it's part of this legacy of being part of the Soviet Union or being a young democracy. People like to vote for individuals, for persons. So the turnout is usually the highest for presidential elections, and we expect it to be the same this time. However, there's a lot of voters now that might find there's not a right candidate for them. A lot of those silent protesting votes that they will not show up thinking that this way they cast a message, they cast a vote. So it's interesting to see. Traditionally it used to be in the high 40s percents, and I think now, well, there's this discussion, there's a reasonable concern it could be lower because there's many undecided or maybe voters who find that neither Sandu nor Stoyanoglu will satisfy their vote and they would rather not do it. So we'll see.
Yeah, and the referendum is also there, but that will also not then really impact the turnouts.
And the problem is the referendum is going to take place only in the second round.
Okay.
So if many people say, hey, I'm going to skip this because I reasonably expect the second round to be the most important game, they will skip on the referendum, which is again another risk, which proves my point. It shouldn't have been done on the same day.
Yeah, that's also an indication maybe of how people look towards certain candidates and the referendum looking towards the turnout of the first round and the second round as well.
Yeah.
Now, very interesting. Thanks a lot, Igor, for all this information. And with that, I think let's round off this webinar. It has been very interesting to delve deeper into the Moldovan political sphere with you. So again, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
From our side, from the European Forum for Democracy and Solidarity and from Foundation Max van der Stoel, we have organized some of these webinars the last couple of weeks, and we also keep organizing this. So keep in touch with us with our newsletter. You can subscribe on our website as well. And next week, we'll also have a webinar on the Georgian elections, which is also an interesting one. And I suppose also in a similar sphere than you also see in the Moldovan election. I see a lot of analysis also like combining the two and combining the narratives of both elections. So look out for that. We'll also be on Thursday, and more information will follow as well. So again, Igor, thanks a lot, and let's stay in touch, maybe to the parliamentary elections next year as well. And